Welcome to this explainer. There's this invisible web surrounding us every single day, even though we rarely notice it. We're talking about agency law. It's literally the web of relationships that lets the entire business world function. Without it, corporations couldn't operate, stores couldn't sell anything, and the modern economy would just grind to a halt. Today, we're going to map out exactly how this web is spun, who gets caught in it, and what actually happens when the strings get tangled.
To set the stakes right out of the gate, listen to this from 19th century Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story. He said, "It is a universal principle in the law of agency that the powers of the agent are to be exercised for the benefit of the principal only." Wow, that is a heavy, absolute standard. When you act as someone's agent, you're taking on this tremendous legal and ethical burden. You're agreeing to put their interests entirely above your own. No exceptions.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for the explainer. First, the nature of agency. Second, the fiduciary duty. Third, agents versus contractors. Fourth, forming the relationship. And finally, duties and liabilities. Let's get to it.
Section 1. The nature of agency. The invisible web of business. So, at its core, agency is a relationship where one party, the agent, agrees to represent or act for another party, the principal. It really boils down to three vital ingredients: consent, control, and acting on another's behalf. Both of you have to consent to this arrangement. The agent is out there negotiating and transacting business with third parties for the principal. But here's the absolute kicker. The principal has the right to control the agent's conduct in those entrusted matters. That element of control, it's everything.
Let's ground this in a real-world scenario from our sources. Imagine Amelia. She's an on-site leasing agent for an apartment complex owned by Premier Properties. So she signs leases and accepts rent on Premier's behalf. But what if a maintenance worker she hired gets injured on the job? Or what if Amelia goes rogue and signs this massive, unauthorized contract to completely renovate the complex? Who actually pays the bill? Is Amelia personally on the hook, or is Premier Properties liable? Well, agency law is the exact rulebook we use to answer those questions.
Which brings us to Section 2, the fiduciary duty, the weight of trust.
The word fiduciary is genuinely the beating heart of agency law. It describes a relationship founded entirely on trust and confidence. When you become a fiduciary, you're taking on a strict duty to act primarily for another person's benefit in everything related to your enterprise together. We aren't just talking about a standard everyday business transaction here. It is a massive commitment. And this brilliantly illustrates how the law takes this concept so incredibly seriously. It elevates the whole thing from a mere contract to a matter of morals and ethics. Because an agency relationship is a fiduciary one. Each party literally owes the other the duty to act with the absolute utmost good faith. It anchors all that dense legal jargon right back down to fundamental human behavior and trustworthiness.
Moving on to Section 3. Agents versus independent contractors. Who controls the work?
The contrast here is super stark. And again, it all comes back to that crucial concept of control. Normally, employees who deal with third parties are deemed to be agents, right? Because the employer controls the actual details of their physical performance. An independent contractor, on the other hand, is hired to do a specific job, but the hiring party has zero control over the details of how they physically do the work. Think of it like hiring a plumber for your house. You want the leak fixed, obviously, but you don't stand over them dictating exactly how to turn the wrench. The right to control is the ultimate deciding factor here.
Because so much liability and tax responsibility hinges on this distinction, courts and the IRS use a specific set of criteria. They're going to ask, how much control is exercised over the work details? Is the worker in an occupation distinct from the employer? Who's supplying the tools? What degree of skill is required? You see, unskilled work that's heavily directed by the employer points straight to employee status, but highly unique skills where someone brings their own tools, that points to an independent contractor. And how a court answers these questions can literally alter a business's financial liabilities overnight.
Now, this exact dynamic is what fuels the modern gig economy. By classifying workers as independent contractors instead of full-time employees, businesses can slash their payroll costs by roughly 30%. Legally avoiding things like Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment taxes. And for the workers, well, the trade-off is pretty clear. They gain a ton of flexibility and freedom over how and when they work, but they give up guaranteed minimum wages, overtime pay, and a lot of federal labor protections. It's a massive shift in how this invisible web is structured today.
Section 4. Forming the relationship. How the web is spun.
So how do these powerful relationships actually start? Well, they're usually consensual, and surprisingly, they often don't even require a written contract or consideration. They generally pop up in one of four ways. First, by express or implied agreement, like simply asking your neighbor to mow your lawn. Second, by ratification, which is when a principal retroactively affirms a contract made by someone who wasn't officially their agent yet. Third, by estoppel, where a principal basically causes a third party to reasonably believe someone is their authorized agent. Or fourth, by operation of law, which usually happens in emergencies or family situations where the law steps in to protect everyone involved.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how apparent authority works in practice. Take this classic case. Gilbert Church owned a horse breeding farm, and it was managed by a guy named Herb Bagley. Church's own advertisements directed all inquiries to Herb Bagley, manager. Well, buyers contacted Bagley, and he hand-wrote a guarantee for 6 live foals on a pre-printed contract, signing it on Church's behalf. Now, Bagley didn't actually have explicit permission to make that specific guarantee. But because of his pattern of conduct, which was established by the owner's own ads, he had apparent authority. The court ruled the owner was legally down by that handwritten note. No way out of it.
And finally, Section 5, Duties and Liabilities. The consequences. Once this web is formed, the agent strictly owes the principal 5 distinct duties. Let's run through them. Performance. You have to actually use reasonable diligence and skill. Notification. You've got to keep the principal informed of all relevant matters. Loyalty. You are acting solely for their benefit. Obedience. You must follow all lawful instructions. And accounting. Keeping perfect track of all funds received or paid out.
Let's zoom in on that duty of loyalty for a second, because it has to be absolutely undivided. Our text gives a fantastic example. Say Don hires Leo, a real estate agent, to buy an office building. Leo does some digging and discovers the building is part of a bigger package deal. So Leo secretly buys the properties himself, planning to turn around and resell the office building to his client, Don, for a profit. Yeah, that is a massive breach of fiduciary duty. Leo's actions must be strictly for Don's benefit, period. Absolutely zero secret profit allowed.
When we start talking about contracts, liability shifts entirely based on what the third party knows. If the principal is disclosed, meaning the third party knows exactly who the agent is working for, the principal is liable for the contract and the agent walks away clean. If they are partially disclosed, so the third party knows an agent is involved but doesn't know who the principal actually is, usually both of them can be held liable. And if the principal is totally undisclosed, meaning the third party has no clue they're dealing with an agent at all, both the principal and the agent can definitely be held personally liable for that contract. Transparency literally changes everything.
Lastly, let's talk about tort liability, basically negligence or harm caused to others. Under the doctrine of respondeat superior, an employer is fully liable for physical harm caused by an employee as long as it happens within the scope of their employment. But if a business hires an independent contractor, they are generally shielded from that liability. Why? Well, circling right back to our main theme, the employer does not have the right to control the details of the independent contractor's performance. The only major exception here is if the contractor is doing something unusually hazardous, like blasting dynamite.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to really think about regarding your own professional life. When you look at the work you do every day, the contracts you sign, and the people you report to, are you building your own business or are you acting on behalf of someone else's? Understanding this invisible web of agency law helps you see exactly where your power ends and where your liability truly begins. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into agency law.